I stepped into an elevator and came out in the wrong reality. The moment the elevator doors closed behind me, I knew something had followed me in. My name is Daniela Torres. I was 32 when it happened, living alone in an apartment in Brooklyn that I had finally made into something like a home after years of moving between temp jobs and night classes. I worked as a museum registrar. I cataloged things, handled provenance files and fragile labels, and I loved the consolation of order. Museums are full of fixed stories, dates, donors, accession numbers, and I liked believing that if you kept enough records, you could keep the past from rearranging itself. That belief felt sensible until the Tuesday in November when the elevator in my building stopped being an elevator. The building is old but well kept, brick, ivy during the summers, a narrow lobby that smells faintly of lemon polish and wax. That morning I had left for work with a paper cup of coffee and a sleeve of toast wrapped in a napkin, thinking about a crate of 19th century glass I needed to rehouse. I punched a button for the lobby, stepped in alone, and pressed L. The indicator blinked. The elevator hummed, the soft mechanical breath that had always been a background comfort in my life. And then the lights dimmed, the hum deepened to a note that hummed in my teeth, and the floor never came. The doors closed as if the building had decided to swallow me whole. At first it was ordinary in the terrible way that ordinary things can be terrible. A hiccup in the mechanism, a stuck motor. I checked the panel. No flashing alarms. The phone did nothing. I stood still because the habit of cataloging, observe, note, not leap, made me wait. The hum turned into something that felt like a presence behind my sternum. I watched dust motes hang in the shaft of dim light like a tiny constellation. Then the elevator clicked once, and the doors opened onto a hallway that was not mine. The hallway smelled wrong, metallic, like a coin jar, with a faint scent of rain that hadn't fallen. The wallpaper was a patterned gray I didn't own. At the end of the corridor a window offered a city that was both familiar and uneven, as if someone had taken my Brooklyn and smudged a thumb across it. A billboard I knew by name had different letters. A church spire I recognized had an extra clock face. I remember thinking, with a very small, detached voice of disbelief that sometimes speaks before panic, that someone had redecorated the common areas while I'd been in the car. I stepped out because I always step out. 2 floors down, the hallway broke into a stairwell whose tiles spiraled in the wrong direction, and a door led to a narrow fire exit that looked out over my street, except it didn't. The street below showed my building, but the numbers on the mailbox were unfamiliar. People were moving like they had rehearsed their gestures and kept them just slightly offbeat. A woman pushing a stroller wore a hat that seemed to be made of dark feathers. A delivery truck labeled Torres & Sons, Heirloom Transfers, rumbled by. I rooted through my bag for my phone and found it unresponsive, the screen reflecting my face back with a strange, thin smile. That first several minutes, felt like holding my breath underwater. There was no immediate terror. There was a slow, thickened disbelief, like honey poured over certainty. I told myself to go back, to press the button and step into the elevator that had become a door to somewhere else, but the doors slid closed before I reached them. When they did, the hum returned, a deep settling sound, and the elevator went down, then opened again, onto the lobby that had been mine all along, smelling of lemon polish. The handwritten notices on the bulletin board in my exact handwriting, I kept them tidy. The bell chimed like nothing had happened. I laughed then, because laughter seemed like the adult choice. I told myself the building had been hosting contractors, or that I'd slipped, or that sleep-deprived brains invent spatial jokes. I told myself the rational things you tell yourself when you have to get to work and don't want to be late. I walked out into the actual street, and in the time it took me to order the same coffee I had intended to drink, the memory of the feathered hat and the delivery truck felt diminished, like a dream you try to remember while scrubbing coffee grounds from your teeth. I went to the museum and I cataloged glass, and I made neat labels, and I filed accession numbers with the slow satisfaction of an archivist. For a day, the world behaved. At 6:14 p.m., I wrestled my way back into the elevator with a bag of sandwiches and the last of the office light clinging to my hair. The same sequence began. the doors closed, the low electrical hum, the dimming of the cab. This time I braced. If it happened again, I would not pretend otherwise. I pressed for the fourth floor and held onto the rail the way you hold onto a belief. When the doors opened, the light that hit the cab was wrong, green and done as if someone had filtered memory through a camera. The hallway beyond had the same unfamiliar gray wallpaper, but now it carried a sound I couldn't place at first, like a chorus of distant radios tuned to stations with no language. A man in a business coat stood at the far end, smoking in a way that suggested he had always smoked, a posture that seemed to belong to a photograph. He saw me and tipped his head in a gesture that might have been a greeting, might not. My throat tightened because, by then, the rational explanations were dissolving. Coincidence, contractors, tiredness. Something had threaded itself into the building, and it was patient. I returned to my apartment that night with the lights shut and all the doors double-locked. I told myself that I would call the landlord in the morning. I lay in bed and tried to read, but the letters swam. Sleep didn't come. My mind moved in circles around the image of that delivery truck, the wrong number on the mailbox, the woman with feathers. I imagined possibilities like fevered footnotes, that I had slipped between letters in the city, that the world had a seam and I had snagged it with my heel. I held the edges of my blankets like a manuscript about to be closed. 2 nights later, I rode the elevator again because avoidance is a curiosity's twin. The doors closed and the floor rose and fell in a rhythm I began to believe was a pulse. The cab smelled faintly of ozone, and there was that hum in my teeth. When the doors opened, I expected a corridor different by small degrees, a garbled neighborhood, a few wrong letters on billboards. What I found instead was a lobby that was my lobby, down to the crooked brass nameplate and the scratch on the 3rd stair, but entirely emptied of sound. The fluorescent lights above the reception desk were on, but there were no sounds of life, no distant music, no footfalls, no clatter of keys. On the counter there was a single, plain envelope addressed to my name in handwriting I did not know. I picked it up with the care of someone handling an object about to alter a record. Inside was a single photograph, a Polaroid, soft around the edges with the white fade that makes things look older than they are. It was a photograph of me. In it, I stood in my kitchen, hair in a messy bun, a mug in my hand. The date handwritten on the white border said March 13th, 2028. I remember my bones dropping to chill. The photograph showed my apartment exactly as it looked now, except there was a man in the frame behind me, half hidden by the doorway, whose reflection in my microwave was too narrow to be a shadow. His face was indeterminate, a smudge where features should be. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same unknown handwriting, were 3 words. Do not leave! I understood this as an instruction and a threat at once. I put the photo in my bag and left the lobby without a word. The elevator doors closed, and the hum vibrated with the metallic certainty of a watch spring winding. For 2 weeks after that, the world cracked in small ways. I woke up with the taste of salt in my mouth at noon. My plants, which I watered faithfully, wilted overnight then recovered. My neighbor's door was sometimes the wrong color. My mail included a postcard from a city I had never visited stamped with a postmark from a year that had not yet happened. My phone sometimes showed messages I hadn't received, an invitation to an event that would take place in 6 days, a calendar reminder that unfurled a time that was wrong by a blink. At the museum, a crate of glass I had recently examined arrived with an extra piece inside, a shard that had tag number written in my handwriting but accessioned by someone else. Each anomaly kept me awake by degrees. Each anomaly suggested an elastic, mutable present. Each anomaly made the photograph and its warning press heavier in my jacket like a second heart. On a Thursday, I waited for the elevator and watched people come and go. I studied the angles of their faces and the way their hands folded around coffee cups for the kind of evidence catalogers look for when they want to prove continuity. The building's superintendent, Mr. Klein, a man with a habit of humming under his breath, stood at the corner speaking into his phone. When he noticed me staring, he offered a smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "You seen anything odd?" The words landed like pebbles in a pond. I nodded and asked, in too many words, about contractors, renovations, anything that would allow physics to keep its promises. He shrugged and said, "Old buildings hold on to things. Memories, wiring, cats." He said it like someone reciting a warranty. He glanced at the elevator with a kind of practiced glance that did not linger and told me, "If it ever opens on you, don't step out." I had the image of the Polaroid and the three-word warning and the man in the reflection and the feathered hat all in a small, charged heap in me, and Mr. Klein's sentence felt like the last proper narration before the page turned. That night I stayed awake and listened to the building breathe. At 2:07 a.m., the intercom crackled, and I heard the faint hiss of a voice I could not parse. My shoulders climbed. Exhaustion is a treacherous scaffold. I got up, held on to the banister, and walked toward the staircase because stairs seemed like a proof against slippage. On the third landing, someone had left a Polaroid on the step. It showed nothing but the stairwell, empty, but the white margin had a single scribble. "You were right." I picked it up because curiosity is also a kind of duty. On the back of that photo, the handwriting smaller, was a line like a notch on a ledger. "Find the room with no mirrors." That sentence would have been a riddle if the world were an even thing. Instead, it felt like a key turning in a lock already worn with use. I folded the Polaroid into my jacket and went back to bed with the hum of the building amplifying like an orchestra tuning. The next day I would walk through my own rooms as if they were exhibit cases, looking for the misfiled thing that would explain everything. I catalogued doors and windows with the new, furtive thoroughness of someone trying to hold a place still. I did not find the room with no mirrors that day. I found, instead, a mailbox that had my name spelled differently, then corrected, then circled. I found a neighbor with an extra photograph taped behind a painting. I found a receipt from a store I had never visited with the same handwriting as the back of the Polaroids. Each small discovery tightened an invisible thread I could not see, and as the days accumulated and the elevator continued its errands between realities, my life began to feel like a ledger full of marginalia written in someone else's hand. One night, exhausted and trembling, I took the elevator once more because catalogers cannot check their facts. The doors closed. The hum began. This time, when the doors opened, I was in a lobby that looked like mine had been photographed and slightly misdeveloped. The receptionist's desk had a bowl of glass marbles I had never seen. The receptionist herself, if you could call a posture that, had no face at all. Her head was a smooth, blank plane, like plaster sanded to a dull sheen. She turned to me not with sight but with the tilt of recognition. The Polaroid in my bag grew hot against my hip, like a small animal pressing for freedom. Across from the desk, a corridor stretched long and narrowed, a throat of wallpaper leading to a glass door etched with my name. On the door a small sign read, "Records." I felt the cataloging itch deepen into a need. I stepped forward. As I reached for the handle, the no-face receptionist said one word, as if it could be a hinge. "You." I opened the door because the story had begun in an elevator, and elevators insist on momentum. Inside was a room lined with shelves, and on those shelves, my breath left me like a small wind, were filing boxes labeled with dates, names, and photographs. Each box was my life, flattened into catalog numbers and printed snapshots. They were not just my life. Some boxes contained images of a street with a billboard spelled wrong. Some contained the feathered hat. Some held Polaroids with men in the frames, smudged where faces should be. There were boxes with my handwriting on their flaps and others where the script was unfamiliar. A small placard on the desk declared in typewriter font, "Alternate records cross-reference." The room was colder than the rest of the building. The air tasted like paper and batteries. I reached, not entirely of my own volition, for a box with my name. My hands shook as if someone had asked me to transcribe thunder. Inside lay a stack of Polaroids, each one a version of me in rooms I recognized and rooms I did not. On the topmost photograph, the margin had been written on in the same tiny hand. "When you leave, you take us with you." I understood, with the quiet clarity of a gloved instrument touching a fragile surface, that the elevator was not a mechanical failure. It was a hinge between versions of a city, between versions of my life, and each crossing left marks, postcards, photographs, items misfiled, that suggested an exchange. The danger wasn't loud, it was institutional. The record suggested pattern. Someone, some force, was keeping copies, cross-references, perhaps corrections. We were not simply slipping into other places. We were being noted. On the back of the last photograph in the box, written in ink that had bled into the fibers like a bruise, were 4 words that will live in me forever. You are already in 2. I shut the box, and for the first time, somewhere very deep, I felt the full weight of what that meant. Not only that I could exist in 2 realities at once, but that every choice might be duplicating me, that every exit might be an incision. I closed the door to the records room and left the building shaking. The elevator's hum was a lullaby for people who could no longer trust the axis beneath their feet. That night the city smelled wrong again. I pressed my forehead to the cool window of my apartment and watched the street below, trying to discern whether the woman with the feathered hat would appear. She did not. The delivery truck did not roll by. Instead, a pair of men walked with a crate stamped with a name I did not know and a date that hadn't happened. I slept in fits. In the places between dreams, I dreamed of shelves and labeled boxes and of a ledger that kept adding entries under my name. I woke with the Polaroid warm in my pocket, as if it had been pressed there during the night by unseen hands. I don't know when, precisely, fear becomes something other than fear, when it turns into a profession. For me, it was the night I realized that the records were not just cataloging the city, they were deciding which version of it would persist. And if that was true, then every small act, stepping into an elevator, answering a door, glancing at a photograph, was an act of selection. I felt like a librarian in a vault of realities, and the key at the bottom of my gut was the knowledge that whoever kept those boxes liked order. On a gray Saturday, I returned to the records room. The receptionist had her face again, or at least a suggestion of it, eyes that squinted like a book's margins. She did not speak, but she handed me a key on a brass ring. On the key a single number was stamped, 7. "Find room 7, she said, and the sound of the word came not from her mouth but from somewhere behind the wallpaper, as if the building itself were recommending a chapter. I left with the key like someone leaving an archive with permission to handle the most dangerous things. Room 7, I thought, would be the room where the explanation waited, or the room where the danger lived. I imagined a file labeled mechanism, or protocol, or rules. I did not imagine the small wooden box beneath the floorboard, the ledger with my name on the spine, or the clean, patient handwriting that would tell me why certain doors opened for me and others did not. I could not know yet how far the ledger's reach would go, how many people's lives it touched, and how many small corrections it had made without notice. I did not know that stepping into that elevator would be the first page of a book that someone was still writing. The key was heavier than it looked. It sat in the hollow of my palm like an accusation, the brass cool and oddly damp despite the central heating. Walking back through the lobby felt like walking through the spine of a book I had been reading in the dark. The pages were turning themselves. I kept expecting someone, the no-face receptionist, the feather-hatted woman, a delivery driver in a truck stamped with a future date, to step out of a doorway and demand to know why I had been meddling with the margins. No one did. The building was patient. It let me move like a cursor across the text. Room 7 was not where I expected it to be. Numbers and buildings obey convention, ascending, neat, like the teeth of combs. Here the hallway folded like a map with deliberate mistakes. I found the door tucked in an alcove behind a staircase, a little wooden slab that might have been intended for storage. The paint so well worn the number stamped into the wood was almost an afterthought. I fit the key into the lock as if inserting a spine into a book. The tumblers inside turned with a small, satisfying sound, like a drawer being closed on an old drawer of secrets. When the door swung inward, the air hit me like a current from some other climate. Room 7 was not a room at all but a narrow chamber that ran perpendicular to the building's architecture, like a stitch between two halves of the world. Shelves lined the walls, but they were not labeled with dates or file numbers. They were labeled with verbs: remember, forget, repeat, arrange, spare. On a low, central table sat a stack of notebooks tied with twine. The notebooks were brittle around the edges, each one named with a place and a date. Brooklyn, 1987. Downtown, 2024. Unknown Coast, 2032. The handwriting on the labels was familiar and not. It had the looped neatness I used when addressing envelopes. But there were tiny slants and flourishes that I did not make. I opened the first notebook because curiosity and dread marry easily. Inside was an inventory like the ones I wrote at the museum, but instead of glass shards and crates, the entries were human moments. Woman at bus stop laughs at nothing. Face altered 0.3%. City light shifted toward blue at 20:03. Family on third floor miscounts plates. Missing child report filed under archival anomaly. The language was clinical and obscene in its intimacy. Whoever kept these books cataloged lives the way I cataloged objects, as entries, as variables, as items to be preserved or pruned. Page after page described small corrections made to reality, an extra comma inserted into a marriage record, a year rerouted on a birth certificate, a photograph replaced in an album. These were not monstrous acts in the way bloodthirsty myths are monstrous. They were administrative. They were the quiet rerouting of futures. My hands trembled and I read faster. Somewhere between a ledger entry about a bus driver who had been reassigned to another route and a note about a street lamp that had been realigned, I found an entry with my name. It was dated 3 days before the first Polaroid had appeared in the lobby. The entry listed variables. Torres Daniela. 32. Occupation, registrar. Crossings 3. Note, unscheduled duplication incident. Suggested protocol, observe, collect evidence, restrict exit. Below that, in smaller, almost apologetic script, someone had written. Subject resists classification. Possible entropy when left unmonitored. There was a breath-sized gap after the sentence that felt like the building itself swallowing breath. I read on and found annotations in the margins, comments by different hands, some impatient, some almost intimate. Keep her close, she notices. If replicant becomes aware, initiate conservatory measures. Do not allow dissemination of ledger to duplicates. The language alternated between clinical distance and a kind of possessive reverence that made my skin prickle. I had always believed records were for protection. These records had become a mechanism for containment. I did not know whether to be furious, terrified, or flattered. None of those words were the right scale. The room, with its verbs for labels and its notebooks of human errata, suggested a bureaucracy of realities. Someone, or something, kept things tidy. Someone wrote down mistakes and filed them as if they were receipts. The ledger was not a narrative, it was an operations manual. And my name, inked with a casual hand underlined twice, suggested that I was not just an object of study. I was an anomaly. The next shelf held objects, not photographs. A faded scarf that smelled faintly of lemon polish, a marble with a hairline crack that matched one from my building's lobby, a Polaroid of a man with his face blurred. Each object had a short note attached. Returned to subject November 3, 2027, withdrawn December 14, 2025, cause cross-contamination, reference, feeder phenomenon. These tags used words I had never heard connected to living memory: cross-contamination, feeder phenomenon, conservatory measures. The more I looked, the more I felt like a specimen in a museum's less respectable back room, the place where broken dolls and misfiled ghosts were kept in acid-free boxes. My fingers found a note folded into one of the notebook spines. It was written on stiffer paper, the kind used for official memos. The heading read, "For internal use only." Under it, a short list of rules. 1. Do not explain ledger contents to subjects. 2. If subject crosses without prior authorization, attach Polaroid and directive. 3. Preserve subject's sense of agency, reduce panic thresholds. 4. If subject attempts to destroy records, escalate to containment. I read the rules twice, then a third time, because to read them was to feel the logic constructing itself around me. They gave me agency, but only as a variable in their architecture. They were rules meant to protect the ledger's integrity, not my well-being. The arrogance of it was staggering. Someone had made a system to judge which lives should be smoothed and which should be smudged. At the far end of the chamber, a larger book lay open on a lectern. Its pages were thicker, the script denser. It looked like a register of registers, the metabook that made sense of the smaller inventories. The title, typed in a font that suggested a machine had consented to handwriting, read, Index of Divergences. The page before me began with a sentence that had been stamped into my head like an epitaph. Divergences are not accidents, they are amendments. Under that sentence, a map unfurled, not of geography but of choices. Lines radiated from a single point and branched into faint tributaries. Small notations marked nodes. Elevator 4, first crossover, 11:03 a.m. Residency overlap, Torres 32/duplicate 32. Unresolved crosslink, #7 room. As I traced the lines with my eyes, a faint smell of ozone rose, and for a moment I thought I could feel the weight of all those choices like grain in my palms. The ledger was an engine of curation, and I had tripped its delicate belts. There was a slip of paper tucked into the index with a single instruction, typed in capitals: if subject becomes aware, do not allow subject to leave covered spaces. The word covered seemed chosen to evoke the idea of smallness, the suppression of movement. Below it, in another hand, a sentence had been scrawled like an aside. She has taken photos. She will try to make us public. She will try to be brave. It felt obscene to be the subject of someone else's tender disdain. I left the room with my heart hammering in pockets of rhythm I had never known. The corridor swallowed the sound of my feet as if the building was smoothing itself behind me. The key slid into my back pocket as if it had never been out. Outside, the air tasted of ordinary street noise, and a bus hissed by like a great, tolerant animal. I did not go home. I went to the one place that still felt reliable in the face of this architecture, the museum. At work, I moved through my tasks with the efficiency of someone rehearsed in the mechanics of containment. Cataloging glass felt like a refuge because glass fractures in predictable ways. Paper must be handled at the edges, always. The ledger had rewritten my sense of what counted as secure. I kept glancing at the clock as if time itself might be a variable to watch. Around noon, a delivery arrived, a plain envelope, identical to the one from the lobby, with my name on the outside. Inside, a Polaroid this time showed the museum archive, my hands at a crate with accession numbers. Behind me in the photo, in the reflection of the protective glass, was a second Daniela, my face slightly older, my hair pulled back differently. The margin bore one line: "Stop looking for us." The photograph was a command and a confession. The second Daniela in the reflection was not simply a reflection. She was an image of possibility, older, contained, perhaps resigned. The ledger's handwriting matched the margin. Whoever had been managing this was not cruel in the theatrical way. They were methodical. They were trying to keep the branches from sprouting. From that day, the air around me changed. People I interacted with sometimes blinked as if a small fact had been removed from their memory. My colleagues asked me about a meeting I didn't attend, and memory rewrote itself like fog. An intern, who I was sure had been introduced to me 3 days earlier, looked through me as if searching for a name tag. Objects were misfiled in ways I could only see. A pen that always ended up in my coat pocket, though I never left it there. A lunchbox moved from fridge shelf to shelf in patterns that suggested someone else walked by after me. The sense that someone was tidying the edges of my life became a pressure I could feel through the soles of my feet. At night the Polaroids multiplied. I found them tucked under a pillow, slid into the seam of a couch cushion, left in the hollow of my bathtub. Each one was a version of me at a moment, and each had instructions. "Do not exit 7th floor." One read in gentle cursive. "Collect no additional photographs." Another urged. "We will call you Daniela. Do not ask why." The voice and the handwriting tried to be comforting in a way that made me recoil. It reminded me of a curator speaking soothingly to a fragile relic. 2 weeks into my inquiry, I decided to test their limits. The ledger spoke of containment and conservation, of small polite cruelties executed under the guise of order. I had always believed in the redemptive power of narrative. If someone keeps a story, the story can sometimes be reclaimed. I set up a simple experiment. I hid a camera in the hollow of my coat and rode the elevator on purpose, pressing a sequence of buttons in the hope that if there was a system, it would reveal its wiring. I wanted to catch the doorway mid-shift, to see if there was an entity that slid behind a fabric of reality like a stagehand. The elevator hummed. The air tightened. The doors opened. The hallway beyond was the lobby again, but not quite. The light pooled like varnish and the receptionist's smile cut at an angle that suggested patience. I stepped out and walked to the records door, room 7. The camera recorded my hands entering the key, the lock turning. The door closed, and the hum of the corridor faded to a thin, musical whine. I worked quickly. I took photographs of notebooks, of tags, of the index. I photographed the ledger, and I placed a Polaroid of my own face onto the lectern, face up, as an offering. On the back of the Polaroid I wrote one sentence in a shaky hand. "You are not the only ones who keep things." I slid that picture into my coat and left. The camera was in the hollow of my coat. The recordings were in the device's memory, which I had told myself I would destroy if anything went wrong. The next morning, the camera was gone. My coat was folded neatly on a chair, the hollow emptied as if a hand had smoothed it to make a place for something else. On the table where the camera had been, a new Polaroid lay face down. When I turned it over, my stomach fell like a trapdoor. The photograph showed the scene of the records room at 2:03 a.m. The lectern was empty. On the lectern's surface, where the Polaroid of my face should have lain, there was a small note in the same neat handwriting. "Do not tempt the margins." I had tempted them. I had poked a ledger that had teeth. That night, sleep was impossible. I walked my apartment with the deliberate attention of someone handling a fragile exhibit, closing drawers, turning pages, placing objects together so that nothing seemed newly introduced. I set the Polaroid from the ledger on my kitchen table and left a small coffee stain on its edge with the hope that the world would have to acknowledge the human act. When I woke, the Polaroid had been moved. It lay at the edge of my bed with a margin marked by a smudge like a thumbprint. On the back, a sentence, now 3 words joined to the previous instructions. "You found room 7. The building was not content to be a place. It assigned roles, and I had stepped into one. I felt watched, catalogued. But more than that, I felt enrolled, as if invisible staffers had written my name into a roster I could no longer ignore. The next day, the receptionist called me by a name I didn't use. The ledger called me a subject. A Polaroid addressed me as a curator of my own existence and told me to stop. The line between being an observer and being observed had dissolved into a fine dust that settled on everything. I realized that knowledge itself had become a type of hazard. Knowing the ledger, the rooms, the key, made me a threat to their architecture. And the building, for all its veneer of order, had preferences. It preferred neatness and smallness. It preferred the human world when it moved like a metronome, and not a tree. In finding room 7 I had made myself noticed, and the kind of attention I had attracted did not belong to a friend. The building's patience frayed, and the ledger's marginalia tightened into directive. On the margin of one of the notebooks, in a strike of ink that looked almost furious, someone had written, "Subject contests their file. Schedule follow-up, integration." Integration. The word made my throat close. It implied a protocol, a meeting, perhaps a person who would speak to me as if I were a manuscript to be edited. I understood then that whatever stewardship had been exercised over reality did not intend to negotiate with its subjects. It intended management. I had one more choice. I could leave the building and avoid the elevator and, in doing so, perhaps let the ledger fold me into an easier lint. Or I could continue to look until I either found a way to break the indexing system or prove to myself that the world could be wild again. I did not know which option would be safer or which would be braver. I had never been sure that bravery and safety ever lived in the same house. I decided to return to the records room at midnight with nothing but a torch and the determination to read until my eyes could no longer make sense. The building was quieter at that hour, like a library after the last reader leaves. I climbed the stairs with my palms sweaty and my knees tight. The corridor smelled of old paper and the faint ozone I had come to associate with ledger pages. The door to room 7 opened without my key. The latch was already turned. Inside, the notebooks waited like patient animals. The index lay open to a new page, one I had not seen before. Its heading read, "Subjects who seek their records." Under it, a short list started with a name I recognized not as belonging to me but as a neighbor on my floor. Mrs. Halpern, crosslink complete. Under that, another entry. Unknown mail, contained. And one more, written in a hand that trembled slightly as if pen had been forced. Torres, Daniela, active. Note, subject has removed camera. Suggested response, friendly consultation, escalation if subject persists. I felt the full absurdity of my life in the way one feels the length of a rope only once it's tied to a nail. The ledger anticipated me. It accounted for me. It considered me a variable to be managed. The margin of the page bore a final instruction in a hand that did not try to be kind. Schedule consultation 3 a.m. Bring photograph. Do not attempt to remove records. The time on my watch read 2:58 a.m. The building, it seemed, loved punctuality. I set the alarm on my phone, not because I trusted an app to save me, but because the ledger had used time like a metronome, and I wanted to keep pace with whatever formality it demanded. The clock on my microwave blinked in its electric monotone while I prepared myself, a small backpack, a flashlight with fresh batteries, the last Polaroid I had taken of myself, the one I had written on with the sentence, "You are not the only ones who keep things." I slid the photograph into the back pocket of my jeans like a talisman and left the apartment with my key cold in my hand. The stairwell smelled of lemon polish and dust. The banister felt the same, worn smooth by people who had handled it for decades. I moved through the building like someone walking through the aisles of a library after hours, careful not to wake slumbering catalogs. The lobby was dim. The receptionist's desk was empty. The elevator hummed with its soft, indifferent note. I told myself that if this was a lattice of small cruelties, then punctuality might be its only ritual. I pressed the button to the 7th floor and felt my stomach knot in that thin, internal way that always announces a curtain about to rise. When the doors opened, the corridor was colder than usual. The light pooled in narrow, edited patches as if someone had decided certain spaces deserved illumination and others did not. I could see the door to room 7 at the end of the hall, a small rectangle like the mouth of a drawer. Someone had propped the door open, so the room breathed a faint air of paper and old glue. The index had told me to come at 3 a.m. The clock in the corridor read 2:59. I moved forward in the small interval. Inside, the records room was already awake. A low lamp burned on the lectern. The index lay open to the page that had summoned me. A chair had been pulled out as if someone had been interrupted and meant to return. The notebooks sat in their ranks, patient as a cultivated orchard. On the table, the no-face receptionist, if she had ever been faceless, sat with the soft, practiced posture of someone waiting to receive testimony. She looked up when I entered with eyes that were too precise. I felt my breath hitch as if some small animal inside my ribs had flattened against a trap. There were no threats in the room's demeanor. There were only instructions and routines. The receptionist gestured toward the chair with a movement that could have been hospitality or a directive. I sat as if seated in a consulate, my hands folded in the way you'd fold hands when someone else reads your file. A book lay open before her, a ledger much like the index, but thinner, more intimate. On its topmost line, my name had been written and underlined in the reserved script I had come to recognize as the ledger's. The handshake of the pen across the page was oddly neat, like a surgeon marking a site. I placed the Polaroid on the lectern, face up, the phrase I had written catching the lamplight. The receptionist's fingers, long and pale as bookmarks, touched it for a single second before moving to close the ledger. When she spoke, the sound did not come as a single voice but as if the room arranged itself to make syllables. The words were not meant to scare me, they were meant to administer a truth I could not unlearn. "You have seen the records," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have." I said. My voice was thinner than I intended. I read about myself. Read enough to worry? She asked. I read enough to know I'm not a mistake. Her expression, if it can be called that, softened with something like the pity of someone handling fragile paper. Subjects often read and think of themselves as mistakes, she said. They are not. They are deviations that require care. I heard the euphemism the way you hear a clock click, routine and inexorable. Why me? I asked. The question felt adolescent by the time it left my throat. I wanted a large, mythic cause, a curse, a cosmic misalignment, a single villain with a ledger. Instead, the answer was much smaller and colder. You notice, she said. Observation is contagious. The sentence sat between us like a ledger line. I wanted to argue with it, to point to the first time the elevator had opened onto a hallway I did not know, to the Polaroid with the note, "Do not leave," to the way my phone filled with messages from futures that might never be. But argument would only be a footnote here. Instead, I asked the question I had been carving into my sleep. What do you want from me? The receptionist looked down at her hands as if reading a page I could not see. Cooperation, she said at last. A subject that resists becomes a tax. A subject who is willing to be referred becomes documentation. You can be enumerated or you can be freed, but freedom bears a cost. Freed how? The word felt obscene to say aloud, as if freedom were a ledger entry I might be charged for later. Erasure, she said. Or reconciliation. She spoke the terms plainly. Erasure meant the kind of absence that did not leave a hole. It was more like a gentle retraction from the page of reality, a smoothing of divergences until no question remained and no Polaroid showed a second self in a reflection. Reconciliation sounded even worse, a ceremony in which the ledger intervened and reallocated memory lines, shifting people into roles until their duplication no longer threatened the system. You can't be erased, I said, not certain if I meant it as defiance or plea. Many have been, she said. Not always wholly. There are traces. Echoes. That is the reason for the notebooks, to track the aftertaste of absence. I put my hands on the Polaroid and felt its cardstock like cold skin. What about the copies? The duplicates I have seen? We reassign, she replied. Sometimes a duplicate is sent a life parallel to yours in which they believe the ledger's corrections are their own memories. Sometimes they are held in conservancy, kept safe until a place is made. There are many soft solutions. A soft solution for a life sounded like an insult. You said, I stammered because I wanted to know whether their compassion extended to my duplicate's experience. You said someone's handwriting wrote "Do not leave." Do you send warnings? The receptionist's hands folded. Not always, she said softly. Sometimes a warning is an attempt to minimize harm. Sometimes it is an experiment. The administration tests outcomes and catalogs them. Some subjects receive an envelope with a photograph and instructions. Some just wake to changed memories. It depends on the divergence's gravity. My stomach folded. The ledger had been experimenting with people like specimens, and I had been an accidental test. Why the elevator? I asked. Why the building? She allowed herself a small, almost unreadable smile. Buildings are efficient. Elevators are nodes. Where people congregate, the threads of reality are denser. It is easier to cross. Crossings. The word felt oddly intimate. I pictured strings and stitches in a room full of seamstresses tugging at threads without a conscience, only procedure. Can I stop this? I asked. She closed the ledger with the soft slowness of a book that understands the gravity of the page. You can ask to be reconciled, she said. You can be contained. Or you can be left to alter things further and perhaps cause cascades. The ledger does not prefer chaos. It prefers order. I thought of all the small decisions that had rippled. The feathered hat. The delivery truck. The woman whose child had been noted as missing in a notebook under archival anomaly. The thought of being reconciled, of having my life smoothed, felt like surrender. But the alternative was an endless multiplication, A life in which every step might spawn another self and someone else would catalog me again. Is there any way to make them see us as equals? I asked. The idea was naive. The ledger did not treat lives as equals. It listed them in margins, and margins are for notes, not for narratives. She looked at me as if I had asked whether it was possible to change the laws of physics with a wish. If there is, it is not in this room, she said. This room preserves. It does not negotiate souls. She rose then and from a drawer retrieved a brown envelope, the same shape and texture as those that had appeared in the lobby and at my home. Inside was a single card. On it, in the ledger's familiar ink, were two options: reconciliation or conservancy. There was a line beneath each option with a space to sign. Sign? I repeated. Signing is an acknowledgement, she said. It is a legalistic gesture that the ledger recognizes. It does not bind you metaphysically, it binds you administratively. If you sign for reconciliation, the process begins. If you sign for conservancy, you consent to being moved into an archive maintained for duplicates. My hands shook. There was a terror in choosing because both options felt like being put on a shelf. And yet, the ledger had assumed I would make a choice. Its bureaucracy was designed to resolve anomalies by ritualizing them. No, I said. I won't sign. The receptionist's gaze, otherwise placid, hardened like the corner of a page folded too many times. Refusal is counted, she said. Resistance is recorded. It escalates responses. What response? I asked. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw, in the exact slope of her mouth and the set of her shoulders, a human fatigue. Integration, she said. A team will come. They will be gentle. They will be clinical. They will try to make you fit. If you still insist on remaining a variable, the ledger will administer final measures. The final measures were intentionally unnamed. The silence that followed them was hungry and bureaucratic all at once. I could feel a future closing like a door I had not consented to. I stood up because standing felt like movement. Resistance always feels better when you're on your feet. I won't be catalogued, I said. Not like a specimen. You are already catalogued, she replied, almost sorrowfully. That is why we are speaking. I wanted to leave, to run into the stairwell and climb until the building's geometry became nonsense and the ledger could not follow. But the reception's hands laid a small object on the lectern, a Polaroid. I recognized the photograph instantly. It was of my apartment, taken from an angle I alone used when I took pictures for the museum's database. In the frame, both Danielas stood facing each other across the kitchen counter. They were not smiling. Between them lay the ledger itself, as if the book had chosen to make them its device. On the photograph's back the ledger had written a single line. Last chance. I felt my chest constrict. The building had patience but not mercy. Its ledger made choices in the name of order. I had the stubborn, self-destructive pride of someone who keeps reading even when a story is a warning. I walked out into the corridor with the brown envelope heavy in my pocket. The receptionist's voice followed me in that same room-arranged fashion. Whatever you decide, she said, we will note it. I went home and did what I had always done in small crises. I made tea and bundled myself in a blanket and tried to think in the rational cadence of my old life. The Polaroid of the two Danielas sat on my table like an accusation. I thought of the version of me reflected in the photograph, older, resigned, perhaps quiet. I thought of the words I'd chosen to write on my own photograph, "You are not the only ones who keep things." The phrase felt thinner now, like a signal fired into a fog. I did not sleep. At 2:45 a.m., I left my apartment, my key heavy in my pocket and the brown envelope in my hand. I walked to the building with the bizarre resolve of someone who has decided the ledger's rules are themselves a problem to be catalogued. The lobby was dark except for the night light above the reception desk. The elevator hummed, patient as a heart. I rode it to the 7th floor and climbed the stairs the way someone walks onto a stage to interrupt a performance. Room 7's door was closed. I fitted the key into the lock and felt the tumblers turn with the same private satisfaction. The door opened to a lamplight world. The receptionist sat behind the lectern. The ledger opened before her. She lifted her head as I entered, and there was no surprise in her face. "You've come back," she said. "I have," I said. I placed the brown envelope on the lectern between us and folded my hands. The lamplight made triangles on the table. The notebooks looked like sleeping creatures. "I won't sign." Her fingers closed over the envelope like someone closing a lid. She did not look impatient. She looked like an archivist who has just been asked to remove a book from a shelf. "Then we must follow procedure," she said. "Procedure?" I repeated. "It is not arbitrary," she said. "We follow the index." I thought of all the small mechanics hidden in words like index and procedure, and noted that I was suddenly less afraid of being polite libraries and more afraid of the people who used them to hide decisions. "What is the procedure?" I asked. She reached into a drawer and removed a small bundle tied with a string. It looked like a child's box of keepsakes. Inside was a photograph, an old, sepia portrait of a woman from another century. The receptionist laid it face up on the lectern. "This is a subject who resisted," she said. "She insisted on not signing. She was integrated. The ledger preserved her memory in small photographs. You can look at them if you like. We do not erase the past entirely." The photograph was of a woman with sharp eyes. Her posture said fatigue and stubbornness both. I traced the edges with my eyes and thought of how my life might be reduced to an artifact in someone else's archive. I thought of how many people, before me, had been folded into the ledger's rationale. "We will not be cruel," the receptionist said, "but we will be precise. You will be visited." The word visited had the softness of a counselor, and the finality of a notice. "By whom?" I asked. "A team," she said. "They will speak to you kindly. You may refuse. You may explain your reasons. But the ledger will proceed." I left the room as if unrolling a page. The envelope in my pocket was warm. The building had given me another deadline, and the ledger had already framed it. Outside, the street was ordinary, and the night air smelled like something I used to call possibility. I wanted to run. I wanted to take a bus and disappear into the kind of anonymity buildings could not catalogue. But anonymity was a fiction. The ledger had fingerprints on its margins and a penchant for efficiency. If it wanted me, it would find me. If I tried to flee, the ledger would be patient and the world would rearrange itself. At 3 a.m. a knock came at my door, so gentle I thought at first it was my own pulse. When I opened it, there were 3 people, 2 women and a man, each wearing coats too neat to be ordinary. Their faces were the sort of faces that could be forgettable in a crowd. One of the women held a small notebook like a ritual implement. They smiled with the warmth of bureaucrats trained to make people consent. "We're from Records," the woman with the notebook said, holding the book as if it could hurt me. "We're here to talk." They offered me chairs like a delegation. They spoke in the soft, measured language of people used to convincing people that the smoothing of their lives would be merciful. Their manner made me angry in the way of someone interrupted in the middle of a sentence that matters. "We need to understand your experience," the man said. "We want to know what you've seen, what you remember." I told them everything: the feathered hat, the truck with my name on it, the Polaroid left on the stair, the records room, the notebooks labeled with verbs, the index that mapped choices like a river delta. I told them I had found a ledger cataloging the world, that my name had been there and underlined, that the building opened between realities and somehow marked people with Polaroids and warnings. I told them about the photograph with my double and the microwave's reflection, and how my coat had been rifled and my camera taken. They listened with the patience of people taking a deposition. Their eyes were soft but not without the steely glint of people accustomed to implementing decisions. When I finished, the woman with the notebook closed it slowly. "This is significant," she said. "We appreciate your candor. We have procedures," added the second woman, in the voice of a mediator. "Integration is not violent. It is an administrative process. We will help you reconcile the divergence." "How?" I asked. The man outlined the process in small strokes. They would interview me further. They would make copies of my Polaroids and cross-reference them with other entries. They would attempt a reconciliation that involved careful relocation of memories and, if necessary, a transfer of the duplicate to a conservancy, safe, quiet, away from interference. The words were meant to soothe. They didn't. "What if I refuse?" I asked. They explained the procedures for refusal as if reciting policies from a manual: follow-up assessments, increased monitoring, invitations to attend voluntarily scheduled consultations that escalated in frequency. At the end of the catalog of refusals, there was the option of containment. I thought of the ledger that had cataloged people and the notebooks that had recorded modes of divergence like scientific notes. I thought of the woman whose photograph the receptionist had shown me. There was a pattern. The ledger smoothed out things not with grand gestures but with small, inexorable adjustments. My refusal felt like throwing a pebble into a river the size of an ocean. In the days that followed, the team came and went like a slow wind. They checked my mail, tested the seams of my existence, asked me questions about my memory and my perception. They were both gentle and exact. They took notes and offered me tea. I saw, in those visits, the ledger's dual faces, the one that preserved and the one that administrated, both convinced of their own compassion. Their presence made me feel both observed and considered. One afternoon, when the late sun slanted across my kitchen table, a packet arrived without delivery markings. Inside was a Polaroid showing my apartment's kitchen, the same angle as before, but now the two Danielas were closer. The one I recognized reached across the counter and took the other's hand. The one whose face had been smudged in earlier photographs now had features, a look like mine that was resigned and old. Under the photograph, in the ledger's precise hand, were the words, "We prefer reconciliation where possible." A sense of futility slid through me like cold. I had tried all the ways to be human: argument, defiance, paperwork, and the ledger answered with procedures. There was a logic to it that was not interested in me as a person but as a line item. I understood then that trying to beat the ledger at its own game might be like arguing with a climate. You may change a degree or two but not the system's will. The team returned with a new member one evening, a woman whose hair had been cropped close in a style that made her face look like a clean index card. She carried a small device, something between a camera and a scanner, which she placed on the kitchen table. She told me it would map my memories, not to make them vanish, but to ensure the ledger's reconciliation would be precise and minimize collateral misplacement of memory. "Think of it as a backup," she said. Backup. The word felt obscene, like a comfort offered before amputation. I told her I didn't consent. She smiled with the practiced softness of someone who had already recorded refusals in neat scripts. "Consent is noted," she said. "But we must proceed." If the ledger's logic were a machine, this was the moment the gears turned and steam hissed. They placed the device near my head. It hummed like a bee at the edge of hearing. The woman activated it, and I felt a pressure like the pressure of a sea on a windowpane. Images flashed behind my eyes: my childhood in a small Texas town, the museum crates, my mother's laugh, the feathered hat in a hallway I had never seen before. The machine mapped my memories with a sympathy that was clinical. It drew lines around the anomalies and marked them with color codes. It was the ledger's hand with a mechanized precision. When it finished, the woman printed a small sheet and handed it to me. On it were coordinates, time stamps, and locations, indicating where my memories intersected with divergences. One line was highlighted in red: Elevator 4, 11:03 a.m., first crossover. Another line bore my name where the ledger marked the duplication as active. "They will begin reconciliation," the woman said softly. "It will be like editing a paragraph. We will keep your voice." I wanted to laugh then, because my life had become a paragraph someone else edited. The idea that my voice would be kept was both absurd and terrifying. Who kept my voice? Who translated the tone of my life into an indexable byte to be preserved? That night, alone in my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the last Polaroid, the two Danielas near each other across the counter, hands touching. For the first time, fear sat beside sorrow. They made a sort of terrible company. I thought of the ledger's notebooks of verbs: remember, forget, repeat, arrange, spare. I thought of the ways in which language had been used to sterilize lives. I thought of the numerous small acts that had already been performed against people in the name of order. At 2:50 a.m., there was a soft knock at my door. The team had arrived, calm as rain. They spoke in low, patient voices. They explained that reconciliation would begin in moments. They insisted it would be humane. If I allowed it, they said, the process could integrate my duplicate and leave me with a life that matched the ledger's design. I thought of the feathered hat and the woman with the stroller moving offbeat. I thought of the way reality had shimmered at the edges. I thought of the boxes in room 7 labeled with verbs and the notebooks that recorded bus drivers and street lamps as if they were variables. And I realized, with the clarity of someone watching the last scene of a play, that the ledger's care came at the price of my autonomy. "Do it," I said. The words escaped me like a breath. I don't know if I meant them as surrender or mercy. The team nodded the way a surgeon nods when a patient consents. They prepared for the reconciliation with the same calmness with which they had prepared for interviews and crossing assessments. The woman with the cropped hair adjusted the device near my temple and explained that reconciliation was not erasure. It was more like aligning two photographs so that their edges matched. It would redistribute memories so that duplication did not occur. It would be precise, careful, a conservation of experience into a single line. They began the process, and for a moment it felt like being rearranged by a gentle wind. Images folded over one another and smoothed. The ledger's hum was audible now, the building seeming to pulse with a quiet, organized energy. I felt the duplicate's presence, an echo, soften and move toward me as if two threads were being braided back into one. Memory bled across edges like ink dissolving in water. I felt grief at the loss of multiplicity, and relief at the promise of singularity. Then, in a moment that felt like the tearing of a delicate paper, I heard a sound at the edge of perception, a small, human sound that didn't belong in a room of clinical procedure. It was like a cough or a sob or a name. The receptionist looked up, alerted. The team paused. The woman with the cropped hair adjusted the device and spoke a single command into it. The sound receded, like a small animal retreating back into the walls. When the procedure finished, the woman printed a small Polaroid. It showed me standing in my kitchen, alone. I looked at the photograph, and for a breathless second I felt relief. The ledger's reconciliation had worked, my life singular, tidy. The team left as if they'd completed a task. The next morning, the world resembled the one I had known before the elevator swallowed me. The billboard had the letters I expected. The mailboxes bore the numbers I recognized. The feathered hat woman did not cross my path. The absence of multiplicity made the city feel less crowded, and yet, somewhere in the high, smooth spaces where the ledger kept its records, I suspected an echo remained. The records room would file the Polaroids and note the closure. The notebooks would bear a neat entry, and the index would mark the divergence as resolved. I returned to the museum and cataloged glass as if nothing had happened. But the knowledge of what had happened lived in me like a scar behind the lung, visible only in certain postures. Sometimes I would find a Polaroid in the pocket of a coat I hadn't worn since the reconciliation, a small artifact left behind like a fingerprint. Once, tucked in an old donation, I found a photograph of the woman from the receptionist's collection, the subject who had resisted and been integrated. She smiled in the photograph, a small, private smile, and I felt grief for a person who had become an entry. Years passed with the careful persistence of a ledger being kept. The building continued to hum, and the elevator opened and closed and occasionally delivered someone to a hallway that was slightly wrong. Sometimes a stray Polaroid appeared in the stairwell like a leaf. I learned to move in the world like someone who has seen a seam, gentle with the edges, careful not to catch the hem of reality on my fingernail. I kept cataloging glass at the museum, keeping order where order could still be kept. On an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, several years later, I rode the elevator out of habit. The doors closed, the floor rose, the hum was familiar. The panel's lights blinked. The elevator stopped and the doors opened onto my lobby. my lobby with its lemon polish smell and notices in my handwriting. I stepped out and walked past the reception desk. The woman behind the desk, different from the receptionist who had once had no face to begin with, looked up and offered me a small smile. On the counter, a Polaroid lay face up, 2 hands touching across a kitchen counter. I felt a small freeze in my chest, and then, unexpectedly, a laugh escaped me, one that had not been catalogued or reconciled. It was small and incredulous. I picked up the Polaroid, and on the back, in a handwriting I did not recognize, were 4 words. "We still take notes." I carried the photograph home and placed it on the table. Even in the life I had reclaimed, there existed a ledger, an institution, and a word for every act. The knowledge of that bureaucracy lived in the way I moved and the small acts I took to be careful, locking doors, double-checking mail, avoiding elevators when I could. The memory of the other Danielas, the duplicates, the notebooks of verbs and the index of divergences, lingered like a residue, either fully removed nor fully integrated. Sometimes at night I smelled lemon polish in the dark and imagined the hum of that elevator like a distant choir. Sometimes I thought of the subject whose photograph the receptionist had shown me. Sometimes I wanted to find her, to ask whether the integration had left her with the feeling of erasure or with a new, quiet life indoors. The ledger had made choices for us, and the world had been adjusted in small, administrative ways to erase the uncomfortable multiplication of possibility. Occasionally, when the city shifted and the edges of my world felt thin, I would take a Polaroid of something ordinary, my mug, an empty chair, the corner of a street. I would write on the margin, "Remember this." Not an act of defiance so much as a small human ritual, a way of keeping a breadcrumb. I pressed the photo into a small box and labeled it with my own hand for myself. In the years that followed, the box filled slowly. It was not much, but it was a private leisure. The building remained, its walls full of verbs and its rooms full of notebooks. The elevator continued to open and close and occasionally offer an alternate seam. The receptionist continued to do her work, and new faces took up the role of archivists, administrators, conciliators. Human lives continued to be indexed and folded in ways that made them manageable to an institution that prized order. It was not pure malevolence. It was a kind of gentle terror, the knowledge that our moments could be revised by a bureaucracy that believed itself to be benevolent. Sometimes, in moments of weary indignation, I would imagine a different ledger, one that saw multiplicity as a virtue, that allowed for more than one path, that documented choices without ironing them flat. But those imaginings remained small rebellions, delicate as fingerprints. The building and its index persisted, taking notes like a watchful, patient archivist. I do not know if the ledger that recorded my divergence will be there until the end of the building's days. Perhaps, one afternoon, some clerk will close the ledger and take it away in a box that will itself be catalogued. Perhaps the scene will wear thin and the elevator will stop bridging realities. Or perhaps the ledger will continue its quiet work, not as a monstrous institution but as an efficient one, the kind that believes order is kindness. I do know one thing with a clarity as sharp as a line on paper: the world is kept by people who write things down, and sometimes their pens are instruments of mercy and sometimes instruments of control. The ledger that tended to the divergences did not always do harm in the way we imagine harm. It operated on the slow logic of preservation. But preservation needs choices, and choices require someone to decide. On most days, that someone will be an unseen hand. On some days, it will be a receptionist with a ledger on her desk. On a few rare nights, it will be a person like me, who stood in a little room at 3 a.m. and tried to argue that human lives are not the kinds of things to be smoothed for the sake of neatness. If you ever ride an elevator and the doors open onto a hallway that tastes slightly different, take a Polaroid. Keep a note. Write something ordinary on it, and keep it close. The ledger takes notes, but we can take them too, and sometimes a private record is the only defense against becoming an annotation in someone else's book.